in the moment. It's like, oh.
Yeah.
All right, looks like it's 2:30. Carly.
Yep. All right, so hi everybody. I'm going to start the session off. My name is Carly Schoenlieber and I work here at USGBCLA. In this session, we're going to discuss building resiliency through social space in affordable housing and green affordable housing, best practices and innovations. And with that, I'll hand it off to Walker Wells, who's going to start us off.
Okay, thanks, Carly. And also John Delaney's here with me. He'll be speaking in the second part. The idea with this is for me to sort of set it up, give some of the premise for green affordable housing and how it's part of fostering urban sustainability, but then also part of the resilience network, particularly if we can design the affordable housing so that common spaces could be used for things that are like we're seeing now, either in LA or statewide, places of refuge where there's air conditioning or clean air, for the residents, but potentially for the neighborhood. So not only can we be building housing, but we can be thinking about the developments as having the potential to be a resilience hub and part of a larger resilience network. A lot of what I'm talking about today is pulled from this book that I also have right here. I keep a copy close. Blueprint for Green and Affordable Housing. It's an update to a book that I helped put together, was editor of about 10 years ago with Global Green. And then over the last couple of years, I've been working with my co-author, Kim Vermeer, who's based out of Boston, to do a kind of full update and revision to the book. And it was just released, well, effectively like a month ago. I think it was July 17th or something like that, available on Island Press. And at the end, I'll show you what the discount code is if you're interested in buying it. But a lot of the thinking is taken from the book that we're very excited to actually have out in the world. If anybody asks you to write a book, say no, because it's like a ton of work. It's almost impossible. And then once it's done, you feel very proud of yourself, but it's quite agonizing, more work than you can ever imagine. All right, so a little bit of prologue to this idea. Why do we need green housing, or green affordable housing? And why do we need special programs to develop it? Well, because, we have people that are low income and, maybe need to have housing stability. And there's an argument for housing, but why do we need to make it green? So these few slides are just a reminder of the way that we used to build stuff, that we used to look at what was around, whether it was wood or stone or adobe. This is the Taos Adobe, I think longest occupied settlement in North America, continuously occupied settlement. But and we would basically say, well, here's locally available materials. Most of them are organic or benign, rocks, logs, mud bricks, and build with those things in ways that were reflective of our climate. And that was kind of how we did it. All of this sort of indigenous architecture had a lot of intelligence to it. And then for various reasons over time, we started to do things like lose connection to our climate zone, or the wind, the levels of precipitation. We started to enclose buildings with air conditioning and cut them off from the outdoors, and we lost a lot of the local intelligence. And then for a while we also started filling them up with a lot of toxic materials, whether it's paints that were off-gassing, flooring that was off-gassing. We still bring in furniture and appliances and electronics that emit halons and have negative health impacts. But at some point we said, well, wait a minute, we should be designing for the climate. We should be thinking about good air, thinking about ventilation, thinking about not exposing people to toxins. And then, in that sentence, this idea of like people comes into the picture, and we start thinking about who we're actually designing for. And it stops being, just a technical problem of making a apartment complex that can fit all of the units together and meet the building codes, but we've also brought the person into the narrative. And that's really who the client is for the affordable housing projects, are the tenants. So the book kind of starts with first principles, and we don't talk about a ton of these things, but it is good to remember that, there is conservation of energy and matter. So nothing goes away. It may transform from, electron, light energy into heat energy or whatever. But, we need to be conscious of how energy moves through our buildings. We also understand that there's issues of entropy and things falling apart. We need to design for durability. You know, gravity is always an issue with making things stand up, but it also has a huge impact on where water goes and how we manage water. Heat through convection and conduction, radiation as well. It's a big part of it. And to be honest, a number of the projects I worked on over the years, I have to remind people that it's not a good idea to put all of your glass on the western side of your building because it gets really hot in the afternoon and it leads to, you know, late summer peak energy demands that can impact the grid, which is exactly what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 days. So just being aware of some of these fundamental ideas, along with the fact that we want to help ecosystems continue to provide their services, whether that's storing water, cleaning water, doing photosynthesis, so on and so forth. So, you know, in the process of making buildings in urban areas, if we can keep these basic principles in mind, it's a great point of departure. Then again, we're doing this for people. So I sort of picked this as maybe an operating principles of people, which is just the universal declaration of human rights. And you can see in here in this third line, you know, well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care. So, you know, access to housing, safe, decent housing, you know, has been recognized as a human right. And so I think this is a way to think of, if people have right to housing, they should have right to affordable housing, they should have a right to healthy housing. And so this gives us a bit of a platform for what we're really trying to aspire to. I think these ideas come together around sustainability, really, you know, looking at the ecological issues, the economic issues, and the social or equity issues, you know, concurrently, thinking about future generations, thinking about equality, thinking about ecological boundaries, and really about this dynamic. And even though we're thinking about making buildings, you know, there are human needs, there are environmental needs, and there are definitely economic concerns that need to be taken into consideration. And a place where these ideas are represented that, you know, is relevant today is with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And, you know, Goal 11, you know, sustainable cities and communities, is one place where some of these ideas are captured. But of course, there's other places that intersect with green affordable housing, you know, number 7, you know, affordable and clean energy, and can make a nexus with a number of these topics. But I, for years, have said, you know, green affordable housing is one example of what urban sustainability looks like, you know, on the ground. It's a little microcosm of what we're trying to aspire to across a larger urbanized area. The next step in this argument is that, you know, affordable housing is very important, and it provides safe, decent homes on the equity side, stable housing costs, you know, environmentally, if the housing is put in the right place, it can be supporting the use of transit. And the argument here is that green building just sort of expands these benefits and enhances them, that they're already there. So it isn't a separate thing to make housing green. It's basically saying we bring in the green conversation to the affordable housing conversation, and it just augments the benefits of affordable housing. So not only are the houses, homes, apartments safe and decent and affordable, but they can, you know, they can provide healthy indoor environments. And if we really think about it from some of these sort of ideas about biophilia, they can be restorative or even therapeutic. Green building is certainly proposing smart use of land, urban infill, brownfield remediation, which is all helping us, you know, use land wisely and preserve natural areas. So that can even sort of augment some of the transit supportive elements. And so this table is trying to show how these two ideas really come together and have some sort of synthesis. In our book, we had a lot of discussion about who's it for and who's actually the driver of many decisions in affordable housing development. We came to the conclusion that it's the project managers. So it's the project managers at places like Abode, you know, Bridge, National Core, Community Corporation of Santa Monica, Venice Community Housing, Eden, RCD, Mission, Midpen, you know, and there's a number of others that do this. And, you know, the project manager is the person that's sort of the steward of the project from, honestly, sort of finding the land, you know, buying the land, going through the planning process to get the entitlements, you know, architecture design, construction, all the way up to sort of handing off the keys to the property management people. So they have a huge diversity of roles. they're also the right person to kind of make friends with if you want to be doing green building, because they're in the middle of so many decisions. And so what this is trying to show is like all of these core project development considerations, that's the inner circle, you know, about health, about integrated design, about finance, about connection to the community, and then sort of expanding outward to look at all of these different dimensions of green affordable housing, you know, which includes services, active design, how to run a design process by having a charrette and setting up a collaborative structure, intersecting the green concepts and strategies, you know, with the pro forma, bringing in rebates and incentives, coordinating construction, making sure the residents know why the bathroom fan is on all the time, for example, and how the thermostat works, and coordinating with the maintenance people. So there's a huge variety of tasks. Our intent with the book was to demystify as many of these so that the project managers could be more active in the decision-making project and really have more agency in that decision-making project process. As we went through trying to figure out how to kind of what really mattered, it keeps coming back to integrated design. This is an old saw in green building, you know, start early, do integrated design, but it is fundamental. And this is a little pithy statement here, but, you know, we're making a system of systems when we make a building, but design really is a process to figure out what that system looks like. And there are ways to think about how this process should work and the things you need to do when you're getting a piece of land, hopefully in a pre-developed area close to transit and services, when you're doing schematic design, orienting the building correctly, massing the building correctly, putting windows on the correct sides, doing overhangs if, you know, there's an opportunity to do it, thinking about the landscaping. The charrette continues to come up as a very powerful tool to catalyze integrated design. And then followed by a number of steps in the design development phase about additional research on products, which would be number 5, cost analysis, number 6, final decision-making 7, getting everything in the construction documents, 8, and then 9, you know, carrying it through construction, and 10 really being, you know, hopefully a formal green building certification process to make sure that what was designed is actually what got built, which is why where I work, Ramey Associates, you know, we're invested in the LEED rating system because we feel like it's a way to make sure the green benefits actually are provided in the project as built and not just in the plans and specs. And, you know, the charrettes in a simple level just bring together people with different perspectives and skills and expertise and sort of a willingness to collaborate. And, you know, the chapter 2 does a lot of description about how to organize a charrette, how to set intention, and, you know, how to run one effectively. So it isn't just a long meeting, but it's actually set up to be interactive, integrative, and sort of a catalytic moment in that process. And in these charrettes, and in this, you know, green housing process, all of these different rating systems kind of walk into the room. Certainly LEED for Homes, Enterprise Green Communities 2020 guidelines are really good. We don't use them so much in California, but they are really good and worth taking a look at. Around health, around biophilia, around community connections. And we're certainly seeing a lot of interest in Passive House. People, you know, looking at Living Building Challenge, maybe not full certification, but pedal level certification for energy, maybe water. And then a continued discussion about what about the larger neighborhood. And my background's urban planning, so I'm, you know, very interested in LEED ND, working on a couple projects and been involved with, you know, eco districts for probably the last decade, and then currently the chair of the LEED working group for cities and communities, and really trying to see how these different efforts, you know, the building, the neighborhood, the city, can work like sort of, you know, Russian nesting dolls and all be kind of mutually supportive. And then these are just a few examples of green affordable housing projects. It's a little bit of my personal story. So this Plaza Apartments, it's got to be 15 years old. It was the first project I ever did a charrette for. I was so nervous. And felt like I was just kind of winging it, which is probably the truth. But thankfully, the people at Letty Madam Stacy were supportive, helpful. Architect who's now at Michael Lear's office, Roberto Scheinberg, worked on this one. And housing for the formerly homeless, you know, right downtown San Francisco, you know, early LEED, early green communities, a real kind of landmark project. This Los Vecinos project that I worked on with Ted Bardicke when he was with Global Green when I was there as well, is one of the first examples of a net zero electricity apartment building that we did. You know, Ted did a lot of this work, but making the building very well insulated, very energy efficient, and then getting as many solar panels on the roof as possible. And when we couldn't get it all on the roof, we ended up having to put some on the carport because this was new and the fire department wasn't sure about how to make things work. And all kinds of technological challenges emerged by doing this project that ultimately were later fixed through sort of code revisions and policy revisions, you know, with the Building Standards Commission and with the Public Utilities Commission. So this is really using the project as the catalyst for change making. A more recent project, the Crest out in Reseda, Michael Maltzen Associates, you know, beautiful building, but incredibly beautiful landscaping. And so what you're seeing on the left is the fire lane. And it's got some, you know, I don't know if it's gridcrete or some other soil stabilization material underneath it, but it's, you know, basically the idea was like, well, hopefully a fire truck never needs to drive here. So can't we have it be landscaped? And and a lot of the thinking was, you know, it's housing for the formerly homeless. They're going to be at the building a lot, you know, should they not have a place to be out in nature and have some of the therapeutic aspect of, you know, connecting with the natural world? And really found a quite elegant way to meet the code requirements, but also provide this sort of higher level of aspiration for the building. Recently platinum certified project, Van Meter Williams Pollock. In San Francisco, you can see the downtown skyline and the Bay Bridge in the background. This is a south-facing corridor, south-facing courtyard. You can see the combination of solar thermal and photovoltaic panels on the building, and you know, high performing, again, LEED Platinum certified. But what's probably most important is it's the first new building that's part of this larger Rebuild Potrero project, which is a LEED for neighborhood development plan level certified development approach to eventually over time take down all of these arguably obsolete barrack style buildings and more knit this community into the surrounding neighborhood, more of a sort of conventional street grid, altering some of the topographic efforts, but more, it's sort of symbolically, you know, the first new building in this large redevelopment program is achieving at a very high level from a sustainability standpoint, and hopefully setting a precedent for, you know, what happens in the future. I'm skipping chapters 3 and 4, which are all about best practices. So I'm not going to get into, with the time I have available, solar heat gain coefficient and, you know, coefficients of performance on heat pumps, but it's all in there. Chapter 4 is really about operations and maintenance. That was largely written by my co-author. She's more of an expert in that than I am. But I thought I'd touch on chapter 5 just to share that there are connections here to funding and financing. And so many people would say, sure, Walker, great ideas, wonderful vision. How do we pay for it? So there are ways that these things get paid for. Over the years, green has found its way into the criteria for allocating tax credits. So in California, we call this the TCAC regs. In the rest of the country, it's called the QAP. In the QAP Qualified Allocation Plan is one of the things that emerges out of this IRS Section 42 that established the low-income housing tax credit, or LIHTC. And what the diagrams you see down below is some work that we did at Global Green a couple of years ago while I was still there, that just looked at the sort of increasing number of green building measures that were included in the QAPs, either as requirements or as optional measures that people could use to get points. In the image on the right just shows the steady increase in the use of third-party programs like LEED, like Enterprise Green Communities, like Greenpoint Rated, like Earthcraft, in the Southeast. And so we start to really see that green has become an expectation at some level in most of the tax credit financed affordable housing. And this is a lot of dense text that is the California QAP or TCAC regs that, you know, if one read through it, you would see that certain sustainable building features are mandatory, and then there are points allocated for earning LEED certification, including photovoltaic panels and a certain amount that's being offset from that. And then another way that affordable housing is quite unique is just through this connection that can be made between utility costs and rent. And so if you take a moment here and go through this, you can see that, you know, if you look at the left, you'd say, you know, in a property where there could be, the tenants could afford $1,000 a month based on their income. What happens is in the calculation, there's an assumption made for utility costs. So if that's $150 a month, then the rent would be $850. But if the building is more energy efficient and or providing on-site produced energy, you could reduce the utility assumptions to say $120, and even give a little cushion for the tenant and increase your rent by say $25, $30, $50 a month, which sounds small, but when you multiply $25 a month across a 100-unit building over the course of a year, it could likely enable you to borrow another $100,000 to $200,000, which again, when you push that back down through a 100-unit building, you start to have, you know, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to work with, depending on how the financing works, which is enough to make a lot of these energy efficiency upgrades, you know, or start to justify some of the investments in renewables. What we're able to do in affordable housing by virtue of this utility allowance process is to bridge capital cost and operations cost, which is super difficult to do in almost every other building typology. You know, you have a capital budget and you can't take future savings and flip it over into the capital side. But in affordable housing, through this utility allowance provision, that's totally possible. And California is the leader in doing this. There's something called the California Utility Allowance Calculator that factors in energy efficiency and factors in solar and lets a project come up with a sort of customized utility allowance that really reflects the fact that it's a LEED building with on-site generation. And this really helps you get green into the pro forma in a very fundamental way, which, you know, is, I think, one of the objectives of truly doing integrated design. It's not just a design physical feature systems process, but it's getting the green into the actual financing of the project. A few other things that you can use to pay for these upgrades that are out there. A couple of things are available through cap and trade and the utilities. So the low-income weatherization program really applies to existing buildings. That's funded by cap and trade and lets you do whole building retrofits. So it can go from, you know, envelope systems, you know, through to solar. The Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program that Ramey Associates is on the technical team with Enterprise for. Part of the way that it awards points that enables people to get money to build projects is by calculating the greenhouse gas reductions that are coming from these different projects. And you get reductions from being close to transit, you get reductions from enhancing the transportation network, you get reductions for density and housing characteristics, and you also get GHG reductions based on the amount of renewable energy that you put into the grid. And then there's a couple of utility programs. Oh, there we go. A couple of utility programs out there that can also offset some of the costs, whether it's the self-generation incentive program or California Advanced Homes. All right, home stretch. Where are we going? So here's a few things that are kind of emerging out there that, you know, I think all of our jobs is to figure out the applicability to affordable housing. So we don't have the, you know, the tail wagging the dog. The purpose of these, you know, affordable housing programs is to generate affordable housing, you know, not necessarily to pay for like cool energy stuff. But to the degree it's applicable, I think we need to see how these innovations can be brought to bear. So we see these code upgrades. We see a lot of discussion about battery storage combined with the photovoltaic, interest in EV charging, discussion about how to do local water management and reuse, gray water systems that continue to be sort of complicated and expensive, but, you know, we still feel like it's worth having the conversation given our climate and climate change. Looking at the neighborhood scale, and I touched on this idea of these buildings being resilience hubs and thinking beyond just the residents, but to the broader community and the role they can play, you at the neighborhood level. Ultimately, sustainability, green affordable housing requires collaboration. And that is kind of a spirit that people need to bring. We also need to be clear on defining what we're doing and why, and clarifying that shared vision. Charrette's good at doing this. Need to agree on sort of the role of the green rater and the HERS rater and the architect and the engineer in the overall design process, so it feels fluid and not disruptive. And we all need to bring our best selves and the skills and behaviors that come to the process. Stay committed to making things green over time, and not just give up at value engineering or, you know, a grumpy code official or a difficult inspector, but to acknowledge what's valuable and important. And then there's this whole issue of just trust. And I think trust gets built over time by all of us working together, knowing each other, and feeling like we're all part of the same effort. And so I'll just close with this quote from Dave Armistead, who's with Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems, a really amazing organization that's based out of Austin, Texas, that just, you know, speaks to trust, and basically saying, you know, when people trust each other enough, you know, you can get over some of these apparent limits and find new abilities that, you know, may not have been visible to us by just sort of following the conventional procedures for doing things in conventional practice. And then this is the end. And there's the book. And so if you go to Island Press and you put in my last name, Wells, I'm told you can get a 20% discount. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Walker. Let me transition screens here. Okay, hi. My name is John Delaney. I'm a project architect with Koenig Eisenberg Architecture. We're a design firm based in Santa Monica, and we sort of operate under the belief that in the power of social interaction to improve daily life, and how that underlies our interest in sustainable neighborhoods, especially with affordable housing being a key component of that. In this presentation, I'm sort of going to touch on some of the things that Walker mentioned, and maybe do a little bit more of a deep dive on some of the individual building components, but hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. So really the four main areas we look at in terms of sustainability and affordable housing, at least from in our design process, are carbon, water, healthy materials, and an item that I like to call made for living. And for carbon, what we're really talking about is energy, both in terms of operational and embodied energy. And we have two ways of addressing energy use, through both passive design strategies, which take into account things like solar access, predominant breezes and views, daylighting, and also through building technology such as induction cooktops, photovoltaics, heat pumps, and innovative materials. We tend to prioritize passive design due to the ability to save on costs without any additional material investment. So it's just basically good design. We generally start the conversation with decarbonization in affordable housing because it's both feasible given California's clean energy grid and the availability of technology in the marketplace, and also just because it's urgently necessary to reduce climate change. And I think the intensification of wildfires are a good example of that. But I think also, in my opinion, water is just as important in how we minimize water use. Like Walker said, it's slightly more difficult to achieve substantial gains in water use after you provide sort of water efficient landscaping, native planting, rainwater capture, and low flow fixtures due to the complexity of gray water systems and their costs. The more, especially if you do sort of a whole building gray water system where you're tying in each unit, it really does get to be not feasible in terms of costs and complexity. So there's really sort of diminishing returns on those types of systems. Also healthy materials. So material palettes generally tend to be quite modest in affordable housing and sort of minimal in variety. So we try to focus on a few key areas where we can really reduce fossil fuels and harmful chemicals. And then made for living. So the idea of made for living is when residents in the broader community view affordable housing as an asset that should be encouraged and preserved. In that sense, it's really automatically more resilient and sustainable, because it's really not about promoting just technologies or building systems. It's really about helping these vulnerable populations by improving public health, and it's shown that affordable housing does improve public health, and also limiting the impact of climate change. It also reduces inequality, especially in disadvantaged communities, by providing permanent, stable, high-quality residences for these populations, which can range from formerly homeless to disabled veterans to low-income families. So it's important to design these buildings with the activities and wellness of the residents foremost in your mind, because these developments should feel domestic and not institutional, and avoid the stigma of sort of subsidized housing. So we'll just talk briefly about carbon, and sort of on a pathway to net zero, which is becoming more feasible every year, really. So sort of what Walker was touching on, this is basically a summary of the marketplace and the regulatory environment for producing affordable housing. We start with sort of analyzing codes and certifications, which include LEED and Living Building Challenge. But as Walker mentioned, we really also look at the financing, because in a big way, financing actually establishes baseline energy targets. It has a real major impact on how we design these buildings. So it's a real critical component to the design process, is figuring out these financing requirements. These are basically issued by the development authorities to ensure high quality housing. And in terms of technology, it's really important, as Walker said, to advocate for innovative technologies and build a good team early in the design process, because critical decisions can be made sometimes before key team members are in place. So it's important, especially from the designer's point of view, to advocate for these technologies as soon as you know about them and want to use them in your projects. So when we build a team to sort of decarbonize buildings, these are sort of the team members we look to get on board as early as possible. And so we work with the project manager from the affordable housing developer to bring these people on board. And sometimes they have people they work with and they prefer, and sometimes we're able to suggest people, but you really need all of these people to really dive into these systems early on and really ensure success later on down the road. I'll talk briefly about passive design strategies. So by sort of using these simple graphic communication tools, this one is used to analyze maximum indoor air temperatures for west-facing courtyard sunshades. You really can focus your material investment where you can make the most impact for things like shading components and for awnings and window treatments, et cetera, because affordable housing does work on fine margins, so value engineering is always a possibility. So we want to maximize the impact. Also, you can use, if you have a good mechanical engineer who's willing to listen, you can also size the mechanical equipment based on these loads that you're modeling early in the process, rather than doing it based on a broad assumption. So these sort of really simple tools that communicate these ideas in a very simple way are really important. I'll just show a few project images. This is the Arroyo. This is a LEED Platinum building in Santa Monica. This is a good example of passive design strategies sort of working in our favor from a design point of view. This has an east-west oriented courtyard, which helps us maximize daylighting and views. It features sort of social stairs and really well landscaped outdoor areas to really feel domestic. And you can sort of see in the interior image of the unit how much daylighting and how you get views to the Santa Monica Mountains, and on the other side of the building out towards the beach. So just using very simple design strategies, we're able to get really good results and minimize energy use just by daylighting. And sort of another example of using light to our advantage, this is a slightly west of north facing facade. And you might think, just intuitively that you wouldn't need to heavily shade this facade, but we provided sunshades based on some preliminary models. And you can see how at certain times of the day, these sunshades really shade these windows very, very effectively. So we're able to minimize heat gain in those residences. this is an example, this kind of shows from the backside all the infrastructure that goes on the roofs of these projects. This shows sort of a combination of PVs and solar thermal, and you can kind of see how much room on the roof the solar thermal array takes up. So we weren't able to get quite to net zero in this project due to the fact that we try to keep floor plates to a minimum so we can get as much natural light into the units and courtyards as possible. The good thing is in the future, using sort of new heat pump technology, you can actually replace the solar thermal system in your Title 24 requirements. You can replace that with additional PVs, which offset the load of the electric heat pump. So you can actually get a lot more renewable energy on the roof, which will be good going forward. Because solar thermal arrays tend to take up a lot of space and they're expensive. So we also think of the activities of the residents that are driving energy use. So these are sort of an array of activities that we consider. These activities we try to tackle using passive design strategies. So to site the building appropriately based on climate and context and sort of surrounding buildings. You can really reduce your loads. And then these items we basically take care of through better technology. Examples are heat pump water heaters, dryers, induction cooktops, switchable outlets. Because one of the things we're always considering is what sort of amenities to provide the residents of affordable housing developments. And we really want to make them feel like they're getting the amenities that any normal, a normal resident in a market rate project would come to expect from just sort of your, a residence that reflects the current standard of living. So things like cooktops and laundry machines. And then just a quick note on parking. The cost of parking spaces is very high, especially on urban infill lots. So about probably 50 to 60,000 per space in the underground parking garage. So any reduced parking is a project's gain, really. Also, underground garages use energy because they require sump pumps and mechanical ventilation. And there's also air quality issues with CO2 and particulate emissions. So, but you also have to think of it in terms of a regional planning and equity issue, because in Los Angeles, affordable housing residents need to take a car. A lot of them need to take a car to go to work. So by reducing parking, you have to consider whether you're actually making it more difficult for these people to find work. So it's always a balance in that respect. It's an interesting question on whether the shift towards a more telecommuting will sort of have an impact on that. This is a project at 1015 Vermont. This just goes to show how you can really do effective transit-oriented design where you reduce parking and also have easy access to metro station. That's what this is designed above the Santa Monica, Vermont metro station. There's 187 units, but only 69 parking stalls, and all of those are dedicated to the commercial spaces. So it's a mixed-use building, and almost all of the parking is dedicated to commercial. It's also good evidence of how the regulations regarding EV charging stalls are changing. They're changing very rapidly, sometimes faster than we can keep up. But just in January of this year, the city of LA issued an ordinance that requires 30% EV infrastructure and 10% installed, which is a major increase over CalGreen and other codes. So we really have to keep on top of that in terms of how much electric load we're planning for. And this is another example of an urban infill project where we really try to maximize the amount of natural light and the width of the courtyard. So to make this feel sort of like a pleasant place to live, even though it's sort of in the middle of downtown. So you can kind of see this is a project that's all studios, and so the floor plate's quite narrow. So you can kind of see how limited we are on space to fit renewables, so photovoltaics, because we dedicate a lot of space to mechanical units and maintenance areas and tiebacks and things like that. So it becomes a real challenge to get to net zero in locations like that. So let's talk briefly about water, and the project that Walker showed was really good in terms of showing how much of a benefit landscaping can be to these projects. We really like to encourage nature. I like to say always that a little landscaping goes a long way, because it's a really cost-effective way to improve health and well-being of the occupants, while also helping to really make these projects feel beautiful and appropriate to place, especially in California, which is one of the most biodiverse regions in the United States, especially when it comes to plant life. So it can function also as an educational and conservation tool, just by providing native landscaping. This is kind of a palette that we are going to use on a future project, paired with an analysis of sort of sunlight. So really using technology to really help out these natural processes and natural ecosystems. And just some simple ways of bringing local landscapes into the project. So we, this is the urban infill project. So we wanted to provide sort of boulders to make it feel more of a, give it more California vibes, bring a little nature to the city. There's not a lot of room to do landscaping on a project like this, but we really try to take advantage of it when we get the space. And other features like grapevines and sort of arbor trellises, even in very small courtyards like this, can really be effective ways of making affordable housing feel appropriate to California. So this is a really simple diagram of a gray water system. This is laundry to landscape. So in most projects, we provide centrally located laundry facilities. We don't provide per unit. So this is a more cost-effective way of at least getting some of that gray water that's being generated by the project into the landscape. So there are ways to integrate sort of laundry to landscape systems that won't break your budget. So when we're talking about whole building systems, conversely, they tend to, you can sort of see by a diagram, they tend to be very complex and not super cost effective. So we even if we were to propose something like this, it would very likely get value engineered, and we try to prioritize in other ways. I'll just talk briefly about healthy materials. So as I mentioned before, we really try to focus in on a few key areas. So this is a great chart that sort of points out where in specifications more references to fossil fuels are made. So we really try to, we focus in on, sections 6 through 9, which really go through mostly plastics, fire retardants and chemical treatments, also roofing membranes and insulation, anything where you might see fossil fuels referenced in the specifications. Windows is also a big one. Vinyl windows are kind of very standard on affordable housing, but we're looking at fiberglass and other options. Aluminum, very difficult to get thermally broken. So we're also looking at sort of alternatives to vinyl, and also carpet and other finishes that have vinyl in them. And then embodied carbon is also, at the front of conversations about sustainability now that we've sort of in many ways tackled some of the energy issues. What are some of the ways to sort of reduce the embodied carbon of affordable housing? Well, there's not a ton of options in terms of structural systems that we can look at. Mostly type 5 construction with wood framing is about it. Reducing parking has a huge impact because of the amount of concrete that you can remove from the project. But again, you have to sort of balance that with what the residents need. Also, there's ways you can do efficient framing techniques or sort of prefabricated, use prefabricated components, but it's not super clear on how much impact that has on embodied carbon or whether it can scale up for affordable housing. And we also, we want to make sure that if we have a chance to do adaptive reuse or use local materials, that we can do that. Here's an example of a project that's an adaptive reuse project. This is the 28th Street Apartments. This is an addition to and a renovation of a Paul Revere Williams building. You can kind of see, how we mixed, the historic with new, and you can sort of see the juxtaposition of historic details with technology. But we still, prioritize having good natural light and good centrally located amenities. In this case, located on the roof, where people can gather and really feel like they're part of a community. Just some additional images of that project where you can see where we provided supportive services, where people can use the internet and also, a gym that is refurbished where people can get exercise. So it really feels like, you're getting a lot of these amenities that you would find in any modern housing development. So just talk a little bit about the concept of made for living. And I show the picture of a mailbox because that's sort of representative of, having a permanent place to live that offers stability. And I sort of created all these keywords that represent this idea. And I really highlighted love, sort of, I guess that's a romantic way of looking at it. But so why would I highlight that? Well, I show a building like this, which is the Horyuji Temple in Kyoto. And similar to the sort of images that Walker was showing, this is a hall that's built over 1,300. It's over 1,300 years old, regarded as the world's oldest wooden structure. And it's made with very, very simple materials, with very simple joinery. So how's this building, made of wood, which is a very modest material? How's it lasted so long? And, a lot of times when you talk about resilience, you're talking about sort of bulletproof materials and very, very heavy structures. It's really because the community will preserve what it values, no matter what it's built from. So part of that is the religious significance with Buddhist rituals of maintenance and cleanliness, but a lot of that is just sort of community valuing its cultural assets, of which affordable housing is one of those. So how do we, make projects, appear like they're made for living? Well, one of great ways, as we mentioned before, is just some simple landscaping techniques. Just street trees are really quintessentially residential in both suburban and urban environments. And you can use some of these financing tools to pay for things like street trees, so infrastructure grants and other subsidies. And they really provide, beauty as well as practical benefits like shade, especially when you're working in suburban environments where you don't have a lot of self-shading from surrounding buildings, like high rises. You really need to provide ample street trees on the street to get good shading and just to provide a comfortable place to walk in front of the building. Here's some images from, this is from David Baker up in the Bay Area, but they, one of the things we like to use as a design device is the stoop, because it acts as a transitional area from the street or the courtyard into the residence, and it sort of breaks down the scale of the development to more granular scale, as well as sort of providing a variety of materials where we can do it and where it's most cost effective. So often seeing projects, on the street frontage where you have a nice variety of materials and scales. It just helps to feel more residential for the residents. And then you get sort of towards the more Los Angeles typologies, stoops and just kind of more cottage-like architectural language. And so how that reflects in sort of an affordable housing development, making a nice entry can make a big difference in making a place feel like a permanent residence. And in larger projects, just having entries off the courtyard where you're surrounded by landscaping and where you have social space is also really good. In terms of balconies, we like to provide balconies that are deep enough so you can actually, use them for activities like hanging out or having a little garden or even having a little barbecue. Because otherwise they tend to get used for storage, which could, again, sort of remind people of these subsidized housing stigmas, which we want to avoid. So really having balconies that act as social spaces where you can host guests, and also so you can use them so you can, for many different functions, is really important when you're considering balcony design. And we also want to think in terms of equity. So when we provide balconies for one resident, we want to make sure all the residents get a balcony. So we wouldn't just provide them for some. And then things like children's play areas. A lot of this is also part of the financing, built into the financing requirements. But we want to make sure that when we're designing affordable housing for families, that we consider people of all ages, whether that's seniors or children. So we always want to make sure that if we are designing for families, that there's a place for these children to express themselves physically, especially where outdoor space and park space is not readily available in the surrounding area. And then we also like to, we can integrate some of those features into the building in terms of like feature stairs, where we can paint them bright colors and they sort of become, they encourage physical health. They save energy by reducing elevator trips. People get exercise walking up and down. But they also function as sort of informal play areas because, kids, we're always surprised at how much kids like to play on these sorts of stairs. So it's really great to, it's a really simple device, but it's really effective in terms of, making, really anchoring outdoor spaces using these outdoor stairs. Also we like to, provide community gardens where we can. Sometimes there's some maintenance issues with community gardens because they're a bit, depending on who's operating the building and how actively engaged the residents are in maintaining these things, sometimes they can get a little, they need a little love. But it's a really good way to sort of encourage healthy eating and get people outdoors. And given the climate in Southern California, it's a great way to provide an amenity while not providing additional conditioned space. So if you can do it, also probably do it on the ground level. So people don't have to travel upwards to access these spaces. And also it's much more easy to get good planting sort of in native soil if you have any, rather than bins like this where you can do sort of small edibles. If you can get native soil, you can get things like edible fruit trees and things where, really can really grow a lot of food. This is an interesting image because when we think about laundry, I mentioned before, we always try to provide it in central laundry rooms. With washers and dryers. That's also built into the financing requirements. Low-tech options like clotheslines can be very effective in dry climates like Los Angeles. But again, do we want to remind people of this sort of, the stigma of subsidized housing where, we want to make sure that people are provided with sort of modern amenities that feel more market rate. So we can plan for these laundry facilities by locating them centrally where they have views of courtyards and where you have kids play areas outside, where people can, if they're doing laundry, it doesn't feel like you're sort of in the basement or in back of house. It kind of becomes an additional social space, whether it's located inside or outside. And how that ties into sort of the main entry. So we don't want to put it too far back in the project. We want to make it sort of part of the central area, maybe anchored by a courtyard where it can really feel like a social space that is pleasant to be in. Because sometimes people hang out for a good bit of time in laundry rooms, so it's important to make them feel comfortable. This is another approach, maybe make it feel more like a front porch where it's just a small outdoor space outside, but there's a glass door you can see out. Just a different approach, a different scale project. And then in a lot of projects, we also, provide supportive services in addition to housing. So the developer or the building operator has people on staff who can help assist with life transitions, either from homeless to housed, or from unhealthy to rehabilitated, or from unemployed to employed, and so on. So this can, this sort of transition. Upward transition can really reinforce the idea of a home and residence. And I'll just close by saying that it's really a privilege to get to work with the socially minded developers and operators, because they're really, as are we, very much concerned with providing the best quality housing we can get for these people. So that's it for me.
All right, so we have a few minutes for questions. I will start with a question that came in for John. So somebody's wondering, are features associated with passive survivability, building a sanctuary, part of your design strategy with your developers? And how do buildings maintain a safe thermal environment when the power is out?
Currently, we don't. We haven't really integrated passive survivability measures in our projects, as far as I'm aware, in terms of sort of wildfire and earthquake protection. Yeah, as far as I know, we don't typically do that, because floor space is kind of at a premium, and we want to make sure that we're really designing these spaces for daily living. In terms of power, we typically don't provide backup generators unless it's required. They are expensive, and they also, it's if the conversation towards battery storage, shifts, if that becomes more cost effective, we might look at doing that in a more, making that part of a standard design approach. But a lot of times we'll provide backup generators on high-rise buildings because they're required for egress. So you want to make sure that the elevator is working in the event of a disaster. But on low-rise projects, we typically don't provide power backup.
Yeah, and I can say, some of the standard green building practices actually contribute to passive survivability. So, a well-insulated, tightly sealed unit, with good glazing is not going to heat up as fast as a building or a unit that doesn't have all of those features. So I think that's part of it. And then, for a number of projects, we're ending up with the photovoltaic panels on the roof, to offset the house loads or to meet, Title 24 requirements. But none of those, very few of those are set up to actually be able to power the building. So because it was always about sort of turning the meter backwards. So I think, John, a number of the conversations recently have gotten into well, the panels are there. What would we really need to do to have an islandable system, effectively a very microgrid, and or to have batteries, that could then enable dedicated portions of the building to operate for some period of time, which gets back to this resilience hub kind of idea and thinking, do you want 48 hours or 72 hours worth of basic services to be provided through your storage system? So it's a little bit of a reframing, I think, as we've kind of moved. Sort of resilience has taken on a heightened presence in the sustainability discourse. All right, what's our next question?
So yeah, maybe both of you could answer this. What you perceive as how the green affordable housing movement is going to move forward in the future? Like, how is it going to change? Are there going to be barriers that we're going to overcome, or new barriers that we're going to encounter? Yeah, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I'll start. I think it might fall into this topic we were just discussing earlier, and John alluded to it. Sort of, these are assets, significant public investments in communities, and so I think there can be a change to say, great, you're housing 100 people. How is the neighborhood benefiting from this? And can the community access the community facility when it's a really hot day or a smoky day, or there's some grid shutdown or some other disaster? But there may be other benefits that could flow to the neighborhood that aren't currently being captured. And I do think that the ASIC, Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program, is fostering some of that thinking by really discussing how are the housing developments connected into the transportation system to not just be efficient as a building, but also support use of transit and VMT reductions and associated GHG reductions. So I think it's a little bit more of the broader context, maybe where we're going. Let's take another question while we have time. We'll let John go first if it's appropriate.
Sure.
Okay.
On the last topic, one thing that we're interested in is getting post-occupancy data from the building operators, because it's something that typically we haven't really asked for, because once they issue the certificate of occupancy and it's handed over to the operator, we're sort of divorced from the project, and we check in every now and then to see how things have aged, but we don't really think of it in terms of tracking the energy use or the water use, or even doing post-occupancy interviews with the residents to see exactly how they're perceiving the building from a livability point of view. So that's one area where I think we're shifting our practice to really try to do more often, and really get the owners more involved in tracking that information.
Mm-hmm.
All right, maybe we have time for one more question. Someone's wondering, is enhanced noise mitigation for sleeping areas overtly addressed in your design/detailing process? And if so, how?
That's an excellent question. Acoustics almost only shows up in school green building rating systems. And a lot of people really do get bugged by the, vibration. Um, and, uh, and I think probably because we're being asked to create as much clear space as possible for solar, we're not able to always put the condensing units and the fans over the corridor like used to be some of the strategies. So there wasn't vibration on the unit. So this is probably a little more technical than my area of expertise, but it's a great question because it really speaks to the lived experience of being in the building. And I just want to emphasize two things before I'll shut up. So, John mentioned this idea of sort of the user experience and bringing the person into the building. And I tried to talk about that a little bit. And I think, that's our role as, green building consultants, design professionals, think about who's going to live there and their experience. And I think, John, you talked about love is maybe a romantic idea, but, I think if you can kind of think about love for greater, humankind and, society and just, compassion as part of the design process, it uncorks a different line of reasoning and I think outcomes in the design process than what may happen if you don't bring ideas and words like that into the room. So there's a book coming out from Enterprise Community Partners called Design with Love in, I don't know, a month or so that tries to speak to sort of how love can become a critical aspect of the design process. So it's something to keep an eye out for. All right, passing the ball to you, John.
Yeah, noise mitigation really depends on where the project's located. So sometimes it depends where land's available. Sometimes we do developments near freeways, so we have extra noise mitigation in the external facades for those projects, as well as additional air filtration measures to make sure that we're not getting the negative impacts from car noise and car pollution. There are some regulations, I think, in CalGreen, as well as some of the NOFA and funding requirements that suggest that all corridor and exterior walls and demising walls are STC 50, which isn't super isolated from an acoustic point of view, but we do try to provide some level of privacy because that also contributes to sort of making these feel like individual residences rather than one giant sort of a giant project or one giant building that's housing lots of people. You really want to make these feel like individual residences that are sort of private, so these people feel at home. It's really not, and acoustics is just one way of doing that.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to try and answer Sarah's question quickly since she's posted it multiple times. So hi, Sarah. This question about dedicating a certain percentage of land for trees. Sure, and here's the nexus, is when you don't have underground parking, you can have dirt on grade to plant trees. And we have all these parking requirements and we're on a concrete podium, it's super tricky to put the trees in because they need real soil and deep tree wells. So there's a connection in there to say, if the development is close to transit, do we really need to have so much parking? And if we don't have so much parking, then we could have dirt at grade and we could have a dedicated area for trees. And a little micro version of this idea was recently adopted in West Hollywood as part of their green building code upgrade, where you could swap out dirt at grade with a tree for an underground parking space. So I think this is some of the kind of code sophistication that we need to be thinking about to bring more nature into the city, think about those ecological processes, think about the urban heat island, and really question, what kind of investments are we making? Are we spending $50,000 on a parking space that maybe we won't need in the future when there are, autonomous vehicles or, or even just close enough to transit? We don't need 2 spaces per unit. So, all right, you're welcome, Sarah. Good question.
No, that's great. We really love when we can get natural dirt. And
yes,
we can plant trees and sizable shrubs. It really makes a huge difference.
Yeah,
really makes a big difference and very cost effective, especially if you plant natives and things that are really hardy.
Yeah.
And also just makes it feel more appropriate to place. It makes it feel more California, which is always good.
Definitely does. Yeah. No, in West Hollywood, this, the love of the courtyard buildings came up all the time in our work at Ramey Associates on their green building ordinance. And a lot of that was having space for trees and shrubs and real trees. So we kind of teased out some way to do an exchange to, incentivize that really in the, in the zoning ordinance. But I think it was a very clever approach that we sort of collectively evolved with, with staff and, other folks that all worked on it. Right, Carly, we could talk about this all day long. So you have to tell us, can we take more questions? Are we out of time? We're not in the room. People aren't leaving or walking in for the next session. I don't know what's going on.
Still here, but yeah, we're supposed to end now, 5 minutes ago, actually. But yeah, really great conversation, discussion. I want to thank everybody for attending the session, and I want to thank our speakers, Walker and John. Really interesting stuff that you guys talked about. So thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And thanks, everyone. Thanks for being part of the session. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for joining. Thanks.
Okay.